A real-life two-headed Frankenstein dog. A Pepsi-Cola Navy comes out of the Soviet Union. How one man saved us from nuclear war, and an island full of cannibals. Today we have it all, but first let's talk about death. Number 50. 1 in every 4 Russian men will die before the age of 55. A statistic in any other country that would have some politicians shouting from the rooftops, "State of emergency, dagnabbit!" In the UK, only 7% of men die before 55. In the US, it's closer to 10%. Life expectancy for men in the UK, which has gone down a bit recently, is around 79. For men in the US, according to recent data from the National Center for Health Statistics, it has also just gone down from 76.3 to 75.1. But for Russian guys, it's a staggering 64 years, a worrying figure for such a developed country. As you'll now see, there's a reason for this, something you might say is one of Russia's most indomitable foes. Number 49. The answer is vodka. Sure, we all know booze is bad for the liver and other organs when taken in large quantities, but when vodka starts being drunk like water, there's a problem. According to a study undertaken at Oxford University, the average Russian drinks about 20 liters of vodka a year. But that's taking into account all the non-drinkers and sensible drinkers. Those that booze do so with enthusiasm. And that's why some studies say vodka will end up being the cause of death for close to 40% of all Russian working men. When an expert was asked to explain why Russian men are killing themselves in ridiculous numbers after a life of mainlining vodka, he said, "It's not considered out of order to drink until you can't function in Russia. It just seems to be part of being a guy in Russia that you're expected to drink heavily." Okay, now for something even more shocking. Number 48. You all know how hard the Russian people and other parts of the Soviet Union had it in the Second World War. It's thought that around 27 million Soviet soldiers and civilians died in total, although that number can change depending on what study you're reading. Still, when you consider that all US deaths related to the war total to about 400,000, you can really understand how bad the folks in the Soviet Union had it. Now you'll see the one reason why people had no choice but to fight. Number 47. Refusing to fight in the Soviet Union or deserting as a soldier was often a literal death sentence. It's thought 212,400 people were executed after being accused of desertion, but a lot more soldiers were court-martialed after being accused of doing something that wasn't in line with the Soviet war effort. One study says a total of 994,300 people were court-martialed, with the outcome usually being a bullet to the head or the horror of the Gulag. The historian Max Hastings put the number of deaths by execution at around 300,000. That's some number given the total British military deaths during the war totaled to 383,700. And then there was famine, and that led to a catastrophe like no other. Number 46. It's thought that wartime famine killed around 4 million Soviet people during the Second World War. If you want to explore the pinnacle of this suffering, you only have to look at the Siege of Leningrad, arguably one of the most awful events that happened during that appalling war. The siege lasted 872 days and took about 1.2 million civilian lives. But again, remember, when we're talking about the casualties of war, various research shows different numbers. The number of casualties in this scenario range between 700,000 and 1.5 million. The stories of what happened inside that city will make the hairs on your back stand on end. Number 45. The starved people of the city were so desperate that some of them took down wallpaper, boiled the paste, and ate it. At times, you could see folks walking around chewing on shoe leather. Then, when people started to get scurvy, pine needles were used to extract vitamin C. Elena Martila, who was 18 at the time, wrote in a letter, "Things are getting very bad here. I don't expect to survive this." She actually went around the city drawing sketches of the horrors that faced her daily. She talked about the starvation of people robbed of all hope, describing them as the walking dead. But what's amazing is that some people kept on working. For instance, even with no power in bitterly cold winter, the Zoological Institute stayed open. A guy named Axel Reichardt was working on his most brilliant book, The Fauna of the Soviet Union, when one day he was found slumped over in a chair, dead from starvation. The musical comedy theater stayed open, but the actors were so tired they could hardly move. One of them died on the stage while playing a part in The Three Musketeers. Elena Skrajbina said bodies lay everywhere in the streets. She added those half-dead people who are still around don't even pay attention to them. And then there was the cannibalism. Number 44. While the party officials of the Soviet Union were enjoying their stockpiles of food, some desperate people in Leningrad had turned to eating each other. One man wrote on a wall, "Citizens, down with the regime that lets us die of starvation. We are being robbed by scoundrels who deceive us, who stockpile food and leave us to go hungry." A 50-year factory worker was arrested after that and was executed by a firing squad. Dying slowly and seemingly abandoned by the people that had thrust them into the war, the public resorted to some unsavory tactics to ensure their survival. One January alone, an official report said there had been 42 cases of cannibalism. The bodies were found with chunks of flesh missing from around the legs and breasts. Now, the weakest people were being hunted, not just for their valuables but for their meat. On February 4th, a man visited the militia office, and what he witnessed were 12 women, all accused of cannibalism. None of them denied it. That man wrote in his diary, one woman, utterly worn out and desperate, said that when her husband fainted through exhaustion and lack of food, she hacked off a part of his leg to feed herself and her children. Okay, let's change the subject for now. Number 43. You just heard about wealth on an unimaginable scale, but did you know that right now the city of Moscow has more billionaires per capita than any other city in the world? According to Forbes in 2021, Beijing and New York have more billionaires, but they have more people living there. Hong Kong is also on the list, but it's a city and also a special administrative region of China. There are other cities with a higher concentration of millionaires though, including Geneva, San Francisco, and Stockholm. Number 42. This next one sounds like fake news, but we actually found a large number of resources saying it was a real thing. In school, in Russia, kids are sometimes told not to smile, or at least they're told only to smile when there's a good reason for it. Russians don't tend to smile just to try and be polite. A smile must be genuine, and when you think about it, that's not such a bad idea. We bet none of you knew the answer to this next one. Number 41. If we asked you what the distance between Russia and the USA is, we're sure, like everyone else, you'd be thinking in the thousands of miles. Actually, it's 2.4 miles. That's because of two islands named Diomede and Big Diomede. The big one belongs to Russia and the small one belongs to the US. Right now, the big one has no permanent population, but there's a weather station there and you might find some border guards there too. In 1987, an American woman named Lynn Cox swam from the American island to the Russian island. The Russian leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, said, "Last summer it took one brave American by the name of Lynn Cox just 2 hours to swim from one of our countries to the other. We saw on television how sincere and friendly the meeting was between our people and the Americans when she stepped onto the Soviet shore." Okay, let's talk about space. Number 40. We're going to talk later about how incredibly talented Russian scientists have been through the years. But one thing we imagine you all know is that the first man in space was Russian. His name was Yuri Gagarin and he was a cosmonaut. But what's the difference between a cosmonaut and an astronaut? The answer is there really isn't one. It's just cosmonauts are trained at the Russian Space Agency and astronauts are trained at NASA or other countries' space agencies. We guess we should also discuss the most important matter in space, something the Russians have been quite open about. Number 39. In the year 2000, you might have read a story about cosmic couplings, a project between Russia and the US involving people having sex in space to figure out how zero-gravity sex would work and if it was sustainable if more humans went to space. That story was apparently a hoax. But let's face it, humans are humans, and a long stint in space might be hard when you have to bottle up your sexual feelings and impulses. US astronauts have always been a bit coy when talking about sex in space or even secretly beating the beaver. But you can trust a Russian cosmonaut to tell you how it is. The cosmonaut Valery Polyakov kept a diary, and in it he bared the truth about how he felt up there. He wrote psychological support service and does some nice, colorful movies which help to recover our will to act like a normal adult male. There's nothing to be ashamed of. Number 38. And that's the thing about many Russians, they can be brutally honest, even when someone might get upset. We went to a web forum where Russians discussed this, and indeed, they said they're in general more brutally honest than most other cultures. You say it how it is, unlike, say, a Brit, who might be nice as pie to your face, and then when you walk away, he says, "I really can't with that dude." Another Russian guy even put it partly down to the weather, saying, "Getting straight to the point is considered a vital survival skill when you want to keep out of the cold. Simple as that." Talking about cold, this next one is insane. Number 37. You can imagine that people don't have much time for small talk when they live in the coldest city in the world. That's a place in Siberia called Yakutsk. In July, the temperature might get up to around 25 degrees Celsius, but for many months in the fall, winter, and spring, the place is freezing, with the temperature often somewhere around minus 40 degrees Celsius. The record low there was negative 65 degrees Celsius. But life goes on. Construction workers don't take days off unless the temperature is especially unforgivable, and kids still go to school unless the temperature gets down below negative 55 degrees Celsius. To combat the cold, people wear lots of furs, which is something many people all over the world have decreed. When a Yakutsk resident was asked what she thought about her being criticized for her choice of clothes, she said, "They should all come live in Siberia for a couple of months and see if they're still so worried about the animals. You need to wear fur here to survive. Nothing else keeps you warm." And what if you didn't have furs? Number 36. During Joseph Stalin's time as a leader, he had many people sent to the gulags. This paranoid man didn't think twice about getting rid of the slightest political threat to his power. It's said that during his Great Purge, around 700,000 people were killed, although that number could be much higher. At least 116,000 people died in the gulags, and the winter being responsible for many of those deaths. Number 35. When Stalin was a revolutionary, he himself was sent to Siberian exile a total of 7 times. He escaped 6 times, although once he almost froze to death doing so. This next one is arguably the most insane story when it comes to those horrifying prisons. Number 34. In the 1930s, over 6,000 people were removed from their homes and sent to a special settlement in one of the most remote parts of Siberia. This was called Nazino Island. Any people that tried to escape were shot. When the people got there, there was little flour to eat and hardly any tools to farm with. They were left on a cold, desolate island with virtually nothing. Within 13 weeks, 4,000 of them were dead. Some of the dead were eaten, and some people killed the weak for their flesh. Here's one account of one instance of depravity. On the island, there was a guard named Kostya Venikov, a young fellow. He fell in love with a girl who'd been sent there and was courting her. He protected her. One day, he had to be away for a while, and he told one of his comrades, "Take care of her." They didn't. They tied her to a tree and proceeded to cut off chunks of her flesh. When the guy got back, she was still breathing, but many parts of her were gone. Hence, this place got the name Cannibal Island. Soviets managed to keep the story secret for many years, but it got out in the end. After that, we think we'll do a quick fire round about some really positive things that have happened in Russia. Number 33. In 1869, a Russian chemist named Dmitry Mendeleev published what would be the first periodic table of elements. Number 32. We all love trams, and we have a Russian named Fyodor Pirotsky to thank for building the first electric tramway. Number 31. Method actors are sometimes a bit of a handful for other actors, but you can't argue that people such as Daniel Day-Lewis take acting to another level. We have a Russian man to thank for that. His name was Konstantin Stanislavski. He put the science into acting by developing a complex system that should, if followed, help an actor get right to the heart of a character. Number 30. Russians, or some Russians, believe in superstitions. That's why you might see in Russia that you'll rarely see empty bottles on tables. It's supposed to bring hardship in the future if you leave them out. It might not be true, but some people say it's because when Russians were in France during the Napoleonic Wars, the waiters only charged for the empty bottles they counted, so naturally the Russian soldiers hid them under the table. We bet none of you knew the answer to this next one. Number 29. If you took a quiz in school and were asked which country in the world had the most trees, we imagine many of you would start thinking about tropical rainforests and sprawling jungles. But it is Russia that actually has the most trees in the world. If you ever spent days on end on the Siberian Express, you might have guessed that. In case you were curious, number 2 for the most trees is Canada, 3 is Brazil, and 4 is the USA. Number 28. Counting trees is a pain in the backside, but the estimate is that Russia has a total of 643 billion trees, covering about 45% of the country's land area. Number 27. Another natural record that Russia holds is the fact that it has the largest freshwater lake in the world. That lake is Lake Baikal, and it holds 23,615.39 cubic kilometers of water. It goes down to a depth of 1,642 meters. This means that it holds about 22% of the world's fresh surface water. Number 26. We'll be back with some wacky and weird stuff in a second, but first, you ought to know that the Russian Ministry of Science and Higher Education says there are 270 languages and dialects in the country. Number 25. As you know, the Soviet Union was home to some of the world's best scientists. Those scientists were sometimes hired to work on certain secret military initiatives, and that didn't always end well. One of them we now call the biological Chernobyl, but its more formal name is the Sverdlovsk anthrax leak. In short, biological weapons were being tested at a Soviet military research facility, but on one very dark day in 1979, some anthrax escaped through the vents. That got into people's nostrils in the factory, and the wind blew it to villages nearby. Soon, people started feeling really ill. Some even had blue hands. But the people in charge said it was just a really bad case of food poisoning. It's thought that 66 people died, but of course the authorities tried to play the matter down. In fact, even when American spies started saying it looked like a lab leak, the Russians just kept talking about tainted meat. This went on for years, and anyone who knew the truth was told they'd be in big trouble if they talked. When a Wall Street Journal correspondent went there in 1991 to look at records and chat with people, he came back saying what he found were stories that were riddled with inconsistencies, half-truths, and plain falsehoods. Now for something else that the Russians didn't want anyone to know about, although hiding it was impossible. Number 24. When 2 Russian passenger planes crashed together in the sky in 1979, the first thought of the bigwigs was to try to suppress the news. It wasn't a good look. It made Russian aviation look bad. But it really was a rookie mistake by controllers that led two Tu-134 planes to smack into each other, killing 178 people. But the news was hard to suppress because 17 of the families were part of a professional Uzbek soccer team called the Pakhtakor Football Club. Number 23. Even with all the horrors committed by Stalin back in the day, and we're talking mass torture, millions living in fear, and countless deaths, polls still show that right now he's actually pretty popular. The Moscow Times recently asked how this could be, citing a 2021 poll that said 56% of Russians think Stalin was a great leader. These numbers have been going up for years now. Even though Stalin atrocities happened not that long ago, at least to the majority, the experts say one reason is that the population don't read real history books about Russia and Stalin. According to the Moscow Times, most of these writings show a literal rewriting of history. This means many people are not too educated about the purges, massacres, and Stalin's deadly paranoia. Also, if you watch the YouTube channel Bald and Bankrupt, where a Brit uses his fluent Russian to travel to the nether regions of Russia and parts of the former Soviet Union, many people are stranded in poverty that looks like it belongs in another century. Some of the older people talk about their fondness of days gone by when communism gave them stuff more than they had now. The BBC talked to an expert who added this, saying much of the new love for Stalin is from people who live in harsh conditions while watching the elites live in utter luxury. Okay, one more Stalin story, which you have to admit is kind of funny. Number 22. In Robert Service's Stalin biography, he paints a pretty bad picture of Stalin, even though he does mention that Stalin was very well read and no doubt showed a lot of determination throughout his life. He writes that Stalin often used to throw parties for his officials, but at times these weren't fun at all. They were to check people out, to see how much they drank or didn't drink, or if they blurted stuff out while loaded. Meanwhile, Stalin would take notes, and sometimes after the party a person could be whisked off to a gulag or just fired. This kind of paranoia was exposed recently in a British satirical movie called Death of Stalin. Russia's culture ministry called it despicable, boring, repugnant, and insulting, and banned it. Still, many Russians absolutely loved it. Number 21. The longest railway line in the world is in Russia. It's the Trans-Siberian that we've just talked about, and it's a massive 5,753 miles long. You can get on in Moscow and travel all the way to Vladivostok. It should take 6 or 7 days, and there'll be over 70 stops in some of the most remote places you've ever seen. Now, back to the weird. Number 20. In 1698, Emperor Peter I of Russia went on a trip around Europe and came back thinking that many people in other countries looked pretty stylish compared to the Russians. Russia, he thought, just had too many beards. So he introduced a law stating that anyone who wants a beard must pay a tax, and those who don't pay the tax will be taken to a public place and have their beard forcibly shaved off. Not that much cash was generated, and later in the 18th century, Catherine the Great repealed the law. Okay, we can't get through an entire Russian top 50 without talking about Russian serial killers and the Russian mafia. The country has had some standout criminals. Number 19. With American serial killers hoarding all the Hollywood limelight, we rarely hear about Russian ones, but trust us, this country has some of the scariest, meanest killers in the world, and arguably the worst women serial killers. Olga Konstantinova Briskorn is right up there as one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. When you see her dressed in fine clothes and jewelry, you don't automatically think, that woman beat peasant kids to death. In fact, she killed an estimated 128 people. She was evil, pure evil. She might have built churches, but that was always just a facade for all her sadism. This next woman takes the biscuit when it comes to evil. Number 18. Again, the serial killer in question was a woman of nobility who tortured and killed possibly as many as 147 peasants. Her name was Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova. In the 1700s, she was known all over Moscow for her sadism. After the death of her husband, she started taking her anger out on anyone nearby who was poor. The authorities turned a blind eye to it at the start because, hey, she was a noble, and the victims were mere serfs. But there was justice in the end. Enough people complained, and she ended up being convicted of her crimes. Before she was sent to prison where she would later die, she had to stand at a busy place in Moscow with a sign around her neck that read, "This woman has tortured and murdered." Number 17. As for general crime in Russia these days, the country has been doing something right. There was a peak around 2007, but since then the crime rate has seen a huge decline. The homicide rate has fallen massively from 30.5 homicides per 100,000 people in 2001 to 6 homicides per 100,000 in 2017. While some TV shows depict Russia as dangerous and sometimes hostile, many people who really know what they're talking about say it's one of the most friendly and welcoming places on the planet, and not really dangerous at all provided you don't act silly. People may not smile all the time, but after sharing a few words with the locals, don't be surprised if you get invited into someone's home where you'll be treated very warmly. Still, stay away from the gangs. Number 16. We're sure you've all heard of the Russian Mafia. This is a serious organization that is structured similarly to the Italian Mafia, and when it comes to crime, they have fingers in just about all the crime pies. It's said that throughout the world, the Russian Mafia has 100,000 members and about 18,000 leaders. But who's the boss? Number 15. That's hard to say, but a name that often comes up, it's Semyon Mogilevich. His vast criminal enterprises, according to the FBI, make him the most dangerous mobster in the world. Much of his work is done with men in suits and could be said to be white-collar crime, although the experts say he also has a lot of blood on his hands. As a former anti-organized crime expert in the US once said, "I can tell you that Semyon Mogilevich is a serious and organized criminal as I've ever encountered, and I am confident that he is responsible for contract killings. But he looks so harmless, especially compared to those tattooed guys." Number 14. What the Russian gang tattoos mean is complicated. For example, the Madonna and child might just be a sign that the wearer of the tattoo has been in prison since childhood, or it might mean loyalty to a gang. A cross down the chest usually signifies that the person embraces the thieves-in-law traditions and does not betray the rules of that tradition. Various other tattoos will show you what kind of criminal you are, how many successes you've had, maybe the people you've killed, or how long you've been behind bars. But if you have these tattoos and you're lying about the actions behind them, you could either die or, according to one expert, be forced to take them off with a knife, sandpaper, a shard of glass, or a lump of brick. But we guess you all want to know what those stars mean, the ones that sometimes appear on the arms, chest, or on the knees. An 8-pointed star near the shoulders could mean this person has a lot of authority, and if on the knees, that can mean this person kneels to no one. Some interesting ones are a snake around the neck designating a drug addiction. One guy had eyes just above his waist, which was said to have meant that he was homosexual. Skulls sometimes mean the person has murdered, and the strange one of a girl catching her dress with a fishing line means the prisoner has committed a serious crime against a woman. As for a picture of a dagger going through the neck, that means this guy's killed someone in prison and will do it again if he's paid. Spiders are also interesting, since a spider moving upwards means someone is still active in a life of crime. But if the spider is going down, the person has given up the criminal life. Now for a Russian that went to prison and came out fighting. Number 13. We can't do a show on insane facts about Russia without talking about one of the many amazing writers that came from this country. Fyodor Dostoevsky is the man we'll choose because his story was insane. When he was 13, his mother died. When he was 18, his father, who was said to have been a terribly cruel man, was murdered. It was that time that Dostoevsky started having epileptic seizures. He later put pen to paper and everyone told him his stories were terrible. He was now broke too. So young, he got on the wrong side of the authorities and was sentenced to death. He was sure his death was imminent when he was waiting in the firing line to be shot. Then there was a last-minute letter which stated that he was merely being sent to prison in Siberia. There he was shackled the entire time, both arms and legs, but he felt like he'd been given a new life. He described his cell like this: intolerable closeness, unendurable cold. All the floors were rotten, filth on the floors an inch thick. One could slip and fall. We were packed like herrings in a barrel. There was no room to turn around. From dusk till dawn, it was impossible not to behave like pigs. Fleas, lice, and black beetles by the bushel. He spent 4 years in that hell and then a further 6 years in military exile. He lost a wife, a brother, and a child. Boy, did this guy have a tough life. But he just kept on writing positive things. One of them was, "The darker the night, the brighter the stars. The deeper the grief, the closer is God." This next one is both cute and wonderful. Number 12. Not long ago, it was reported that there was something like 35,000 stray dogs living around the massive Moscow subway complex, but a handful of them, maybe 20, knew which trains would take them to their destinations. They knew the right trains and the right stops. They also seemed to know which humans would be nice to them and who it's best not to approach. It's possible they used smells and lighting to know where they were, but it's hard to understand how they knew how long to stay on a certain train to get off at the correct stop. A Russian scientist summed it up, telling US media, "In Moscow, there are all sorts of stray dogs, but there are no stupid dogs." Number 11. We're sure you've heard of the game Tetris because it's one of the best-selling games of all time. But did you know it was invented by a Russian guy back in 1984? His name was Alexei Pajitnov. He started making some hard cash from his invention over a decade later when he formed the Tetris company. This next one should make you quake in your crocs if you've given it enough thought. Number 10. In 1908, in a remote part of Siberia, was the biggest impact ever recorded in human history. A meteor airburst destroyed around 80 million trees over a massive area of around 830 square miles. Maybe 3 people died, but that's only because this was one of the most remote areas that a rock from space could hit. The thing was probably around 160 to 200 feet wide and traveling at 60,000 miles per hour, but it disintegrated just before impact. Still, it caused tremendous damage. And we are sorry to inform you that asteroids don't choose remote places to hit out of the goodness of their hearts. It was just lucky that it hit where it did. It's estimated that the power of this thing was 1,000 times greater than the atomic bomb that hit Hiroshima. So if something like that hit a big city today, well, we're talking devastation on a massive scale. And why not? Given enough time, any city could win the asteroid lottery. That's why NASA keeps an eye on space and is working on ways to blow up large pieces of space rock before they get too close. Again, we bet you didn't know this next one. Number 9. We imagine you must have thought that the name Red Square had something to do with communism, but it doesn't. The name is actually derived from the word krasny, which means beautiful. Number 8. Russia didn't just put the first man in space, it also put the first dog in space, and its name was Laika. At age 2 in 1957, she went up on the satellite Sputnik 2. Before that, she was one of a number of stray dogs that were taken off the streets and joined the Soviet spaceflight program. They only chose female dogs because it was considered that girl pooches deal better with small spaces. She trained as a cosmonaut, being spun around in a centrifuge and practicing eating jellified food. The Soviets reported that she lasted close to 7 days in space and then was purposefully poisoned. But many years later, the truth came out. Laika actually only survived a few hours. Apparently, the exertion of going up and the subsequent weightlessness was too much for her. And this next story is even crazier. Number 7. You might not have heard of the name Vladimir Demikov. He was a pioneer when it came to organ transplantation, and later he inspired many others in the same field. So when we tell you he's often talked about only in relation to making a 2-headed dog, just bear in mind that his work inspired surgeons all over the world. But yes, you heard that right. He made a 2-headed dog. In the name of medical science, he did it many times. One of his creations appeared in Life magazine, a story about an experiment with a stray German shepherd named Brodyaga and a much smaller dog named Shavka. Once the transplant was done, both heads could see and smell and even swallow. But they only lasted 4 days. His best 2-headed dog lived for a grand total of 29 days. Number 6. Back in the days of the Cold War, both the US and Russia made propaganda films. The US was often depicted as the out-of-control, decadent, capitalist country, and the US made Russia look mean and evil. Unfortunately, a lot of people believed in the hype. Things have changed, but Russia is still pretty strict when it comes to censoring media. The BBC reported in 2014 that President Vladimir Putin had signed off on a ban on curse words in movies, TV shows, theater productions, and other media. That was if they wanted a distribution certificate. But if someone sold DVDs containing swear words, they had to give it the label saying contains obscene language. Putin doesn't like swear words and thinks they're bad for the culture. But many Russians said F you to that law. Number 5. The word vodka actually comes from the word voda, which means water. Number 4. The Moscow subway is actually one of the most beautiful subways in the world, sometimes looking quite majestic. It's one reason why many folks online have talked about how great it is compared to the New York subway system, which looks as though it's part of a dystopian sci-fi movie, perhaps Escape from New York. This next one is just unbelievable, and we're not sure it's legal. Number 3. Reports surfaced that not long ago, some of the more wealthy folks in Moscow didn't take the subway. They liked to drive their luxury cars instead. But when traffic was really bad, they hired fake ambulances to rush through the traffic. Reports say these special taxis cost $200 an hour. Okay, now for something that'll blow your mind. Number 2. It was the 1980s and Russia wanted some of that delicious, obesity-causing drink Pepsi Cola. Russian money wasn't accepted, so instead Pepsi agreed to exchange vodka for the drink. A lot of vodka. Then the Russians said, okay, how about instead we give you 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer? In return, they got $3 billion worth of Pepsi. You might have heard that this made PepsiCo the 6th biggest navy in the world. And while in sheer numbers that wasn't far from the truth, the ships weren't useful and mostly went to scrapyards. The deal was more about business relations between the two nations at a time when communism was coming to an end. As Foreign Policy wrote, PepsiCo was more a middleman than a maritime power. This last one, we all would do well to never forget. Number 1. Little do many people know that one Russian might have saved the world from a disastrous war that could have killed many, many people. It sounds crazy, but on September 26, 1983, Stanislav Petrov did indeed save the world. On that day, he got the shock of his life when he looked at the nuclear early warning radar system at his command center, and it showed that the US had launched an intercontinental ballistic missile. Soon, the system said another 4 were on the way. Was this war? Had the Americans really gone full out this time? This was, after all, a time when relations weren't good between the countries, and the KGB did think the Americans might launch such an attack. As one expert later said, the Soviet Union right then was geared to expect an attack and retaliate very quickly to it. Petrov had to think on his feet. Should he tell his superiors and therefore likely be implicated in starting a deadly nuclear war? That was a big weight on his mind, so he decided to wait for a minute or two. As an expert later said, if he had told the higher-ups, Soviet nuclear doctrine called for a full nuclear retaliation. There would be no time to double-check the warning system, much less sneak negotiations in with the US. But he waited and tried to figure out why the US would send only 5 missiles over. The country had in its arsenal 23,305 nuclear warheads, compared to the Soviets' 35,804. Launching just 5 didn't make sense, so Petrov decided not to do anything. If Russia had retaliated, we're talking hundreds of millions dead. As for Petrov, if he'd been wrong, he would have been convicted of treason and executed. But he was right. The machine was faulty. There were no US missiles in the air. Petrov later said in an interview, "I was just at the right place in the right time." Yeah, it's a good job a steady head like his was at the controls. So we're going to go out on a limb and say that this Russian man was one of the great people of the century and is the happiest ending to this list. Now you need to watch 50 insane death row facts nobody tells you.